Okay, well, we're going to keep on going here with chapter 2. This should be our third and final segment for this video. We should say something about the somatic nervous system next. So we know that the somatic nervous system includes the anatomical cranial and spinal nerves, but we also want to talk more about the functionality of these nerves, especially when it comes to bringing sensory information in to the sensory nervous system. And that's what we mean here to say that the SNS is monitored by the CNS, because that sensory information, of course, is a way of monitoring, right? But also controlled, because there's some motor stuff as well here. Here is a map of all 12 cranial nerves. Not quite so easily labeled in the actual face of our person here, but we can see them kind of where they originate and approximately anyway, and how they feed back into the brain. So number one, on the previous slide, the end of the very last video, I had brought up the issue of the olfactory input, right, from the olfactory bulb through the piriform cortex. And we see that right there with the one, right? So that nerve coming from the nose, it goes back through the olfactory bulbs. You can see there under the frontal lobe of the brain, and gets taken back through the piriform cortex, which you really cannot see there, into the thalamus. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve coming from the back of the eye. This passes through the thalamus. And remember, we talked about the lateral geniculate nucleus. So that's going to be part of the thalamus that relays this back to the occipital lobe of the brain. Optic nerves 3 and 4, these control eye movements, right? So of course, this wants to go to the superior colliculus of the midbrain. Kind of get a sense of that in this picture, perhaps a little bit. Number 5, cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal nerve, right? It means 3 parts to it, right? And we can kind of see that there's different portions of the trigeminal nerve that are coming from different parts of the face, that some control some sensations from different regions of the face, but also some chewing and taste processing as well. Cranial nerve 6 also is going to give us some movements in the face here, including eye movements. 7 gives us some more facial movements here. So that's the facial nerve, and also some sensory components as well. Here, cranial nerve 8 comes from the ears, and that contains both auditory and vestibular signals to the inferior colliculus. So we're going to have to learn a little more about both the auditory system and the vestibular system in later chapters here. Cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and so we're going to get some sensations from the tongue and inside of the mouth and pharynx, and control of the pharynx for speech. 10 is the vagus nerve here, so that's coming from the organs of the body. And this is an important part of the autonomic nervous system that will feed into the brainstem. 11 is the spinal accessory nerve that helps control some of the neck muscles that are an important part of some of those orienting responses we talked about before. And 12 are the hypoglossal muscles that control the movement of the tongue. These are important for chewing and speaking. The somatic nervous system also includes the spinal nerves. So these feed into the spine, right? And so the spine, of course, is divided into 4 sections, right? There's the cranial spine. So the first 8 vertebrae are part of the, sorry, not cranial, cervical. I'm looking at the C's and thinking cranial, but that's the cervical spine. And so the gaps between the vertebrae, this is where the nerves enter and connect to the spine. So you have the 8 cervical nerves, and then below that we have the thoracic spine. And so we have then 12 thoracic nerves. And then the lumbar spine gives us the 5 lumbar nerves. And then we have the sacral spine, which has 5 nerves as well. This drawing on the right-hand side that shows this person here, we see here dermatomes. And so it's important that we talk about what a dermatome is. A dermatome is a region of the body that is served by a specific nerve. So one of the things that you can see here, for example, is a dermatome on the top of the head called C2. And so that means that the nerve that enters the spine, that's the second cervical nerve, C2, that nerve receives input from that region of the body. Damage to that nerve then would entail that there is some, say, numbness in that part of the body. Likewise, for example, look at the part labeled C7. So that's now our seventh cervical nerve. If that nerve was damaged, there would be a pattern of numbness that spans down, as you can kind of see there, from the middle of the back, down on the back side of the shoulder, down the back of the arm and elbow, and down the back of the forearm here, and then affecting the middle and index fingers, right? So this is an important pattern here. We see that this is the way in which the nerves innervate the body is they actually kind of cover these really large sections that span out across large regions, right? And so we can see this kind of, they're kind of organized in these almost like in concentric circles. And so as we see down from the thoracic spine, these nerves sort of provide input related to the back, and what you can't see, of course, would be the belly of the person as well. And then the lumbar nerves kind of regulate a lot of lower back as well as parts of the front of your legs. And the sacral nerves connect up and control a lot of the stuff on the buttocks and on the rear side of the legs as well. Something else we want to understand about the spinal nerves here is that those spinal nerves have both what we call now a dorsal and a ventral component. This is what I had mentioned earlier about how when we talk about the brain, dorsal refers to the top of the brain and ventral refers to the bottom, but let's rotate that. And now I understand, let me go back to this picture in particular, that if we think about the back side of the spine here, right on this person's back, that would be referred to as the dorsal side of the spine. And then the front of the spine that's closer to the belly of the person is the ventral side of the spine. As it turns out, all of these spinal nerves, as they connect to the spine, they branch into two roots, right? So sometimes we talk about a dorsal root and a ventral root, because as this nerve approaches the spine and it branches off, one of those branches wraps around to the back or dorsal side of the spine, and the other branch wraps around to the front or ventral side of the spine. And anatomists had discovered this a long time ago, but it was in the early 1800s that two different researchers, Charles Bell and Francois Magendie, separately discovered the function of these different nerve roots. So as it turns out, if in an animal research, so this takes us back, I had mentioned doing ablation and lesioning studies where you damage nerve tissue in animals to see what happens. This was one of the very first cases of that. And so what they would find is that if you snip the dorsal root, but do not touch the ventral root for a specific nerve that might innervate a limb, what you'll find is that the animal will no longer respond to a painful stimulus applied to that limb, even though they can still move the limb. So that seems to suggest that maybe the dorsal fiber is an important sensory signal where it does not contain motor signals, right? Because the limb can still move, they just don't process any touch information. Conversely, if we do a different experiment where we keep the dorsal root intact but sever the ventral root, then we find that now the limb is paralyzed and cannot move, but the animal does respond if you apply a painful stimulus to that affected limb. So that helps confirm this basic idea that the dorsal root carries what's known as the sensory afferent signal, whereas the ventral signal is the motor efferent signal. So what I said before about ascending and descending signals, right? So the sensory input is ascending, and that's called the afferent system. It brings the sensory input in from the peripheral receptors and then up the spine to the brain. The motor signals are descending from the brain down the spine and then out through the ventral roots to the muscles themselves to trigger muscle contraction. I have here the definition of the dermatome, which is an area of the skin that's subserved or supplied by a specific nerve, right? We saw the mapping in the previous picture there. Of course, worth noting that these nerves do in fact coordinate, work together, so that way we get controlled movement and integrated touch perception, right? We don't notice these dermatomes, right? As I might move my, apply a stimulus across the skin at different locations, I still just experience it as touching my arm, right? Rather than a dermatome. We're not really consciously aware of the dermatomes, right? Because we integrate them so well. So this idea here that that breakdown of, we have a sensory part of the dorsal stream processing, the dorsal root processing, and the motor is the ventral system here, helps us that these are two different systems, right? But it helps us organize the signal, because the idea here is that we want that sensory input to go to the brain, and then what's going to happen is that we're going to do two different things in the brain with this information. And this is where we're going to talk about dorsal and ventral again, but it's different. So this here, when we talk about dorsal and ventral on this slide, we're talking about the brain again. So there's this idea of there being two different streams of processing of visual information, or even of somatosensory body information as well. And the idea here is that there is a pathway that goes up the back or dorsal part of the brain up here that is important for the control of our body. So movement, motor control. It's sometimes referred to as the how channel, because it specifies how to move, how to interact with an object, or sometimes it might be called the where channel, because that kind of spatial information about where things are is an important part of how to move around. Separately is the ventral stream. Here, the ventral stream means we're processing information down the ventral sides of the brain, primarily to the temporal lobe. And that is called the what channel, because it's an important pathway for processing information about what an object is. So this is a very curious finding, because it seems to suggest that the pathways in the brain that are important for recognizing what an object is, so that's object recognition, are actually not the same pathways that are involved in regulating how we might interact with that object, right? So I happen to have my bottle of fizzy water here that I've been drinking from. And so the claim here is that the ventral stream processing helps me look at this and say, this is a glass bottle, but the dorsal stream helps me reach out for it and pick it up. And those two different things are in fact not more or less separate processes within the brain. And that damage to one doesn't interfere with the other. So for example, there are cases where people have a disorder with recognition, right? And they cannot name things. This is called an agnosia. But they can still interact with them quite accurately anyway. And then conversely, we might have some impairment, brain damage that causes us to have difficulty interacting with objects. And this is called ataxia, but we can still name them quite well, right? So here's a picture that shows these two different pathways as they originate from the visual center of the brain, the occipital lobe. And so this idea that visual information leaving the occipital lobe and heading into the parietal lobe, integrating with body information from the somatosensory areas, that's part of the dorsal stream. And so this integration of vision and touch that we might even just want to call eye-hand coordination, maybe a little bit, perhaps. That's an important part of that where or how channel that's used for guiding our interactions with object. But the ventral stream is a pathway that goes from the visual areas of the occipital lobe into the temporal lobe, right? And that's now the recognition channel. Another label here that we're not going to be overly concerned with yet, because we're not yet got into the details, is the reference here to the visual center called striate cortex, and that just means a striped cortex. And this is what happens when you look at some of those cytoarchitectonic maps of the occipital lobe. We see like a really heavy banding of these neurons here. V1 refers to what's called the primary visual cortex, which is the first region that's active in visual processing. What else we have in here is the autonomic nervous system. This is to some extent a little bit of probably review from what you would have encountered in an intro psych course. This idea of the sympathetic fight or flight arousal system. So when you have to run away from a predator, or when you're just exercising and you have to activate the body to have increased cardiovascular output to support muscle contraction, that's the job of the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to activate hormones that will increase cardiovascular functioning, cause a spike in blood sugar to get more energy going to the muscles. Whereas during regular times of calm, the parasympathetic nervous system takes over. It gives us our famous rest and digest system, right? Helps calm the body down from those fight or flight stress reactions, but also helps regulate basic metabolic processes in the body, digestion, sexual function and arousal, eating and feelings of hunger and things like that. Got a lot of nerves here. I think we don't necessarily need to worry about all of the detail here, but I like this diagram here. It really helps us get a sense of the complexity of the autonomic nervous system. And it is a very complex system with a lot of nerves that do a lot of things. When people talk about how many nerves that we have in the gut and how many neurotransmitters are involved in the gut, you can kind of get a sense of that here, right? So, and what we see, of course, is a good lesson to take from this diagram are how the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems sort of work to oppose each other in some ways, right? You can see, for example, how how they affect the heart right there in the top middle there, right? The sympathetic nervous system increases the heartbeat, parasympathetic nervous system slows it down. Parasympathetic nervous system stimulates digestion in the stomach and intestines, but the sympathetic inhibits digestion. Why is that? Because during a fight or flight response, the digestion is not really something that needs to be happening, in part because the energy that we need during a fight or flight reaction is something that has to occur in a very short amount of time. And digestion is a very slow way to get energy into the bloodstream. Meanwhile, of course, if we look at something like the liver has many jobs, but one of it is to store excess glucose. And you can see there that that one diagram shows that the sympathetic nervous system will stimulate the liver to dump excess glucose back into the bloodstream. Whereas parasympathetic helps the gallbladder store that excess sugar back into the liver, right? So we see that all throughout the system here, right? So the parasympathetic nervous system helps to stimulate the bladder for excretion. It stimulates the genitals, whereas the sympathetic nervous system sort of prevents urination, though it does play an important role in the orgasm response, of course, but it's a slightly different, more complex pattern there. Up at the top with the airways and the salivation, we see again a lot of opposing processes happening. That is now the end of our chapter 2 content. So we're good to go there.